In the spring of 1829, a tenant farmer working near the Delaware-Maryland border made a discovery that would expose one of America's most chilling criminal enterprises. As he plowed the field, his horse suddenly sank into the earth, revealing a wooden chest buried beneath the soil. Inside lay the skeletal remains of what appeared to be a man, his bones yellowed with age and his skull showing clear signs of violence. This was only the beginning. Over the next few weeks, authorities unearthed the bodies of at least 7 people on the property, including 3 children. All were victims of a woman whose name had already become a whispered terror across the Delmarva Peninsula, Martha "Patty" Cannon. For nearly 2 decades, Cannon ran what historians now refer to as the Reverse Underground Railroad, a criminal network that kidnapped free African Americans and escaped slaves, selling them back into bondage in the Deep South. But her crimes went far beyond human trafficking. Cannon was also a serial killer who eliminated rival slave traders, witnesses, and even children when they threatened her operations. Court records from Sussex County, Delaware, show that she was indicted for 4 murders, though witnesses claimed her actual death toll exceeded 20. Before delving deeper into Patty Cannon's reign of terror along the Mason-Dixon line, the story calls for reflection. Her network's reach extended far beyond Delaware, touching communities from Philadelphia to the Mississippi Delta. The discovery of those buried remains would ultimately unravel a vast criminal conspiracy that had operated almost without interference for over a decade, shielded by jurisdictional confusion, racial prejudice, and the fact that most victims were people whose disappearances went largely unnoticed by white society. The region where Patty Cannon built her empire was uniquely suited for crime. In the early 1800s, the area now known as Reliance lay at the junction of 3 jurisdictions, Sussex County in Delaware and Caroline and Dorchester counties in Maryland. This strategic location allowed criminals to escape law enforcement simply by crossing county or state lines. The spot was so remote that locals called it Johnson's Crossroads, after the tavern that became the headquarters of the most notorious kidnapping ring in American history. Dense forests of pine and oak stretched for miles, broken only by marshlands and small clearings dotted with isolated farms. The Nanticoke River wound through the region, offering silent waterways for transporting captives under the cover of darkness. Roads were little more than rough paths, and the nearest towns were days away on horseback. For those wishing to operate outside the law, it was an ideal setting. Martha Cannon, known as Patty, arrived in this borderland around 1790. Court records suggest she was born around 1760, possibly under the name Lucretia Patricia Hanley, though she deliberately obscured her origins. Some accounts place her birth in Canada, followed by immigration to Delaware at age 16. What is documented is her marriage to Jesse Cannon, a local farmer with land near the state line. Together they had at least 1 daughter and appeared to live a quiet rural life. Jesse was described by neighbors as a reserved man who farmed tobacco and corn like many others in the area. Their modest 2-story home straddled the Delaware-Maryland border, a fact that would later play a crucial role in Patty's criminal operations. Unbeknownst to their neighbors, the house would soon contain secret rooms and hidden spaces designed to confine kidnapped individuals. Beneath this ordinary exterior lay something far more sinister. The early 1800s marked a turning point in American slavery. After Congress banned the importation of enslaved Africans in 1808, the demand for labor in the cotton fields of Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia fueled a thriving domestic slave trade. A healthy adult slave who might have cost $300 before the ban now sold for over $1,000 in the Deep South. The cotton boom created enormous incentives for criminals willing to exploit human lives. The Delmarva Peninsula was particularly vulnerable. After the Revolutionary War, many enslaved people had gained freedom through gradual emancipation laws or manumission. Delaware and Maryland had large free African American populations working as laborers, artisans, and farmers. Though legally free, they lived without meaningful protection. They lacked political rights, could not testify against whites in court, and their disappearances were often ignored by white authorities. Criminals like Patty Cannon took advantage of these legal vulnerabilities to build their fortunes. Patty Cannon was no ordinary criminal. Contemporary accounts describe her as a tall, physically imposing woman, nearly 6 feet at a time when most women barely reached 5. She possessed great physical strength, a commanding voice and a fierce, intimidating presence. She was known for her violent temper and domineering personality. Her husband Jesse died under suspicious circumstances around 1826, with some claiming she poisoned him. As a widow, she gained full control of the family property. By then, she had already forged the connections that would make her one of the most feared figures on the eastern seaboard. Local law enforcement in the rural border region was weak, corrupt, or overwhelmed. Sparse and transient white populations, made up mostly of small farmers and drifters, had little community cohesion. People minded their own business and often ignored suspicious activities. This isolation enabled Cannon's network to thrive unnoticed for years. Her transformation from frontier widow to criminal mastermind began through her daughters' marriages. Both daughters wed men who were deeply involved in kidnapping free African Americans. Her first son-in-law, Henry Harry Brereton, was a blacksmith who supplemented his trade by capturing free black people and selling them in the South. In 1811, he was arrested in Georgetown, Delaware for kidnapping, but escaped from jail the same year. Brereton's mobility as a blacksmith allowed him to identify potential victims while conducting legitimate business in rural communities. He would note families with teenagers or young adults who could fetch high prices in southern markets. The methods used by kidnappers like Brereton were simple, but brutal. They relied on deception, force, and rural isolation. Often they lured victims with false promises of employment in distant places. Parents desperate for opportunity would agree, unknowingly sealing their children's fate. After Brereton's escape, the first documented murder linked to the Cannon family occurred. Working with Patty Cannon and an associate named Joseph Griffith, Brereton ambushed a slave trader known only as Rigidel at Cannon's tavern. Their plan was straightforward: get Rigidel drunk, rob him of his money and slaves, and then kill him to eliminate witnesses. Court records confirm that Rigidel was shot and killed during the robbery, marking the bloody escalation of Patty Cannon's reign of terror. Brereton and Griffith were eventually captured and hanged on April 13, 1813, but Patty Cannon managed to escape prosecution. The Rigidel murder marked a turning point in the escalating criminal activities centered around the Cannon property. Before this incident, the family's role had been largely focused on facilitating kidnappings and offering refuge to criminals moving through the region. Their willingness to commit murder for financial gain revealed a new level of ruthlessness that would define all of Cannon's future. Contemporary newspaper reports on the Rigidel case painted a grim picture of the crime. The victim had been traveling through the area carrying between $3,000 and $5,000, intended for purchasing enslaved individuals in local markets. He stopped at what appeared to be a legitimate tavern, seeking food and lodging, unaware that he had walked into a carefully laid trap. The conspirators spent the evening plying him with alcohol, waiting patiently for the right moment to strike. When Rigidel finally retired to his room, Brereton and Griffith followed. Neighbors later reported hearing shouts and the sounds of a violent struggle, followed by a gunshot. By morning, Rigidel was dead, his money stolen, and his wagon and horses vanished. His body was hastily buried on the property, beginning what would become a common practice, using the isolated location as a burial site for murder victims. The execution of her daughter's first husband did nothing to dissuade Patty Cannon from her chosen path. Instead, it seemed to sharpen her methods and solidify her determination to build a more organized criminal enterprise. The lesson she drew from Brereton's capture was not that crime brought punishment, but that success required better planning, stricter organization, and more strategic operations. When her daughter remarried, this time to Joseph Johnson, Cannon gained a partner whose skills and resources elevated their enterprise to a new level. Johnson was more than a kidnapper. He was a shrewd businessman who understood the logistics of human trafficking across state lines. He possessed extensive connections throughout the South, expertise in transportation, and most importantly, the financial means to scale their operations far beyond opportunistic crimes. Johnson contributed a key asset to the partnership, a tavern situated precisely on the Delaware-Maryland state line. This location, later known as Joe Johnson's Tavern, was ingeniously positioned so that different rooms sat in different states. This geographic quirk allowed criminals to evade law enforcement easily. If Delaware officers arrived with warrants, suspects could simply step into the Maryland portion of the building and claim immunity from Delaware jurisdiction. the tavern served multiple roles in their growing criminal network. On the surface, it operated as a legitimate business, attracting travelers, generating income, and providing a cover for the constant flow of wagons and strangers. Beneath this facade, it functioned as a holding facility for kidnapped victims equipped with secret rooms and cellars designed to conceal human cargo. It also became a central hub where members of the network could meet, plan operations, and divide profits. The physical design of the tavern mirrored its layered functions. The main floor appeared completely ordinary, a common room for guests, a bar, and several rooms for lodging. But below the surface, cellars and tunnels had been specially built to hide captives. Concealed entrances led to these underground spaces, which were designed to muffle sound and prevent escape. Iron rings embedded in stone walls served as anchor points for chains, while narrow ventilation shafts allowed captives to breathe during extended periods of confinement. The gang that formed around Cannon and Johnson was surprisingly diverse for its time. It included white criminals such as Henry Carr, mixed-race operatives like John Purnell who used multiple aliases, and even enslaved individuals forced to participate in the capture of others. This deliberate multiracial composition was strategic. African American gang members could approach potential victims without immediately arousing suspicion, while white members negotiated sales in southern markets. Purnell, described in court records as yellow or mulatto, was especially valuable. His mixed heritage allowed him to move fluidly between white and black communities. He maintained multiple identities and could present himself as a free person of color, seeking work, or a light-skinned white man engaged in business, depending on the situation. This ability to adapt made him an effective scout for identifying vulnerable targets. During the 1820s, the Cannon-Johnson operation expanded dramatically. Their network extended from Pennsylvania to Louisiana, with documented ties to buyers in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. In Philadelphia, Mayor Joseph Watson, a Quaker known for his commitment to protecting free African Americans, began investigating the disappearances of citizens and tracing them back to the Delmarva Peninsula. His inquiries exposed the vast scale of the criminal enterprise. In 1825 alone, he documented dozens of kidnappings linked to the Cannon gang. Victims were not chosen at random. They were carefully selected based on their vulnerability. Young adults fetched the highest prices in the Deep South. But children were also valuable because they could be trained for specific tasks and provide decades of forced labor. The gang maintained detailed intelligence on potential targets, tracking families and individuals to exploit economic desperation or isolation. They knew who had recently lost jobs, which families were struggling financially, and who might be tempted by distant employment offers. One of the most harrowing accounts came from Lydia Smith, a 25-year-old free woman kidnapped in 1825. Her testimony, preserved in court records, described being held first in Cannon's house and later at Johnson's Tavern, where she was chained for 5 months. She spoke of constant fear, inadequate food, and the looming threat of being transported south. Her rescue by Watson's network ultimately saved her from a lifetime of enslavement. Smith recounted being seized while walking alone near Philadelphia, overpowered by multiple attackers and transported by wagon to the Delaware-Maryland border. The journey lasted several days, during which she was kept blindfolded and chained. Upon arrival, she was placed in a hidden room beneath the Cannon house where she found other captives. She described underground holding areas packed with kidnapped men, women, and children, all chained in darkness. Conditions were deliberately harsh. Little food, no sanitation, and psychological torment as captives awaited sale. Smith also detailed how the gang stripped victims of identifying papers and belongings, gave them new names, and fabricated histories to make their sale as slaves seem legitimate. Those who resisted were beaten into submission. The operations of Cannon's network were an open secret locally. Neighbors knew of the disappearances, the wagons arriving at odd hours, and the suspicious gatherings at Johnson's Tavern. But because the victims were African Americans in a society that dismissed their voices, local authorities ignored the crimes. Law enforcement was weak or indifferent, and the complicity of the white community extended well beyond silence. It provided the cover that allowed this brutal enterprise to flourish. Some neighbors actively supported the criminal enterprise, either through direct participation or by providing information about potential victims. Local merchants supplied the gang with provisions, asking no questions about the source of their payment. Even some law enforcement officials were suspected of taking bribes to look the other way when suspicious activities were reported. This indifference changed only when white victims entered the equation. The gang didn't limit their crimes to kidnapping free African Americans. They also targeted, robbed, and murdered slave traders who passed through their territory, carrying large sums of money. These victims were white men involved in the legal slave trade, and their disappearances drew the attention that African American victims never received. The first documented case occurred around 1820 when a slave trader from Georgia, identified in some accounts as Bell or Miller, vanished while traveling through the area. He had been carrying a significant amount of money, estimated at $35,000, intended for purchasing enslaved people. He was last seen at Cannon's establishment, and his horse was later found in her possession. When questioned, Cannon claimed the man had sailed south with a cargo of enslaved people, but investigators found her story implausible. The disappearance of this Georgia trader marked the beginning of a pattern that would eventually lead to the gang's exposure. Unlike African American victims whose disappearances generated little official response, missing white slave traders had business partners and financial backers who demanded investigations. These men carried substantial funds and had clear itineraries, making their vanishings difficult to dismiss. Cannon's methods for dealing with these traders were calculated and brutal. The men were invited to the tavern under the guise of conducting legitimate business. Once inside, they were plied with alcohol and encouraged to talk openly about their financial resources and travel plans. When the moment was right, they were murdered and robbed. Their bodies were buried on the property, and their money, along with any enslaved individuals they were transporting, was absorbed into the gang's operations. The profits from these killings were immense. A single trader might carry enough money to sustain the gang's activities for months, while the people they transported could be sold through southern networks for additional revenue. Eliminating these men also removed competitors, allowing Cannon's network to tighten its grip on the region's criminal landscape. By the mid-1820s, mounting pressure from multiple directions began to close in on the Cannon-Johnson gang. Mayor Joseph Watson of Philadelphia offered substantial rewards for information leading to arrests, while Governor John Andrew Schultz of Pennsylvania coordinated with officials in southern states to track kidnapped citizens. Their investigations revealed not isolated incidents, but an organized, systematic network that had flourished for over a decade. Watson's reward of $500 represented a considerable amount for the period, equivalent to several months of wages for most workers. This financial incentive began to loosen tongues in communities that had long remained silent. Former associates, disgruntled gang members, and even escaped victims started coming forward with valuable information. The gang's response to this growing scrutiny was predictably violent. Instead of scaling back their operations, they began eliminating potential witnesses more aggressively. This strategy expanded their list of victims to include individuals whose disappearances could not be ignored. The surge in violence during this period reflected Patty Cannon's increasingly paranoid mindset. She had built a criminal empire that reportedly generated over $50,000 annually, a fortune in the early 19th century. But her success had drawn unwanted attention, and she became convinced that former accomplices threatened her survival. The most pivotal figure in the gang's unraveling was Cyrus James, a mixed-race boy whom Cannon had purchased as a slave at the age of 7 and raised in her household. As he grew older, James was forced to assist in the gang's activities, often acting as bait to lure free African Americans into traps. His intimate understanding of the network, combined with his increasing horror at the brutality he witnessed, made him both a crucial asset and a dangerous liability. His position in the household was uniquely tragic. As an enslaved child, he had no power to refuse, but as he matured, he grasped the full extent of the atrocities he was aiding. He realized he was helping destroy the lives of people who shared his heritage and vulnerability. Cannon controlled James through psychological manipulation, alternating between treating him as a favored member of the household and threatening him with violence or sale to brutal Southern slaveholders. She made him believe his survival depended entirely on her protection, ensuring his loyalty through fear and dependency. For years, this kept him silent even as he witnessed increasingly horrific acts. James later testified that he saw Cannon murder multiple children on her property. In one chilling account, He described seeing her carry a wounded African-American child away in her apron. The child was never seen again. He also knew where bodies were buried, as he had been forced to help dispose of them. The murders James described were not impulsive, but deliberate decisions based on Cannon's calculations of risk and profit. Children who became ill or injured were killed rather than treated, as medical care would attract attention and cost money. Young captives who resisted or insisted on their free status were eliminated to prevent complications. Even infants born to kidnapped women were sometimes killed if Cannon deemed them burdensome. The gang's ultimate downfall stemmed from their escalating attacks on rival slave traders. Competition in the illegal human trafficking market was fierce, and Cannon's group had gained a reputation for murdering competitors to seize their funds and human cargo. As law enforcement pressure intensified, this practice accelerated. Dead slave traders could not testify, but this shift in targets reflected Cannon's growing desperation and her fatal misjudgment. She believed she was untouchable because the murders of African Americans had gone largely unpunished. She assumed white victims would provoke a similar lack of response. She was wrong. In early 1829, the buried evidence of her crimes began to emerge. A tenant farmer working land owned by Cannon was plowing a low-lying area that had recently been cleared of brush when his horse stumbled into what turned out to be a grave. Inside a wooden chest, he discovered human bones later identified as belonging to the missing Georgia slave trader from nearly a decade earlier. This discovery prompted a systematic search of the property, leading to the uncovering of multiple burial sites. The farmer had been cultivating land that Cannon rented out for extra income. The area had previously gone unused due to frequent flooding, but recent dry weather made it arable. When his horse suddenly sank into the ground, he initially suspected a natural depression or abandoned well. Only after digging to free the animal did he realize he had unearthed something far more sinister. The wooden chest containing the skeletal remains was astonishingly well preserved, implying it had been buried more recently than expected, despite holding bones that were nearly a decade old. The chest was crafted with precision to fit a human body, revealing deliberate planning rather than a hurried attempt to cover up a crime. This level of preparation suggested a systematic method of body disposal that had been perfected through years of practice. The discovery of the first body in early 1829 set off a sequence of events that would ultimately dismantle Paddy Cannon's criminal empire. Delaware authorities, working alongside their counterparts in Maryland, secured search warrants and launched a comprehensive investigation into every property associated with the Cannon-Johnson gang. The findings shocked even seasoned investigators. Sheriff Joseph Houston of Sussex County, Delaware, led the inquiry, coordinating with Maryland officials and representatives from the Pennsylvania governor's office. This multi-jurisdictional collaboration was unprecedented for the era, underscoring the growing awareness that Cannon's operations spanned state lines and required unified law enforcement action. The search warrants were broad, granting investigators the right to dig anywhere on Cannon's properties where remains might be concealed. This legal protection was vital, shielding them from accusations of trespassing or unlawful searches. The warrants also ensured that any evidence uncovered could be used in prosecutions across multiple states, effectively closing the legal gaps the gang had long exploited. On April 3, 1829, Cyrus James was apprehended in Delaware. Though the exact circumstances of his capture remain somewhat unclear, court records indicate he was attempting to flee when he was taken into custody. Confronted with overwhelming evidence and the threat of execution, the young man, enslaved as a child and forced into a life of crime, made a pivotal choice. He would cooperate with authorities and expose everything he knew about Paddy Cannon's network. This decision was not merely strategic but deeply personal. James understood his testimony could implicate him, but silence meant continuing to protect the woman who had enslaved and manipulated him. His cooperation marked a moral break from the control Cannon had exerted over him for years. James's testimony was nothing short of explosive. Speaking before a justice of the peace in Seaford, Delaware, he recounted murders stretching back nearly a decade. He described how Joseph Johnson, his brother Ebenezer Johnson, and Paddy Cannon shot the Georgia slave trader while the man was eating supper at Cannon's home. James had witnessed them place the body in a wooden chest and bury it. This was only the beginning. His detailed testimony provided investigators with their first clear picture of the gang's full scope. He identified burial sites, named other gang members, described transportation routes for kidnapped people, and outlined the network of buyers and sellers spanning multiple states. Following his directions, authorities began systematic excavations of Cannon's property. In a garden area, they unearthed the remains of a young mixed-race child. According to James, this child had been enslaved alongside his mother and was murdered because Cannon suspected the father was white, possibly a member of her own family. Historical records are silent on the fate of the child's mother, leaving open the grim possibility that she too was killed. The discovery of the child's body particularly disturbed investigators. It revealed the depths of Cannon's cruelty. This was not a rival or an abductee, but a child born into her household, murdered out of racist paranoia and fear. Further digging uncovered 2 more wooden boxes containing human remains. James identified one set as belonging to a child he had seen Cannon beat to death with a piece of wood. The other set belonged to an adult whom the gang believed was a free person with property worth stealing. The consistent construction of the burial boxes showed they had been purpose-built for concealing victims. The burial sites followed a distinct pattern, proving careful planning. Most horrifying, some remains indicated that victims had been buried alive. As news of the grisly discoveries spread, witnesses who had long lived in fear of Cannon began to come forward. Their testimonies added new names to the list of victims and corroborated James's accounts in chilling detail. Among these witnesses was Thomas Freeman, a free African-American who had narrowly escaped abduction in 1827. Freeman recounted being approached in Philadelphia by a well-dressed man offering work on a Georgia plantation. The offer was enticing, good wages and free transportation. But during the journey, Freeman noticed discrepancies in the man's story. Growing suspicious, he fled during a rest stop and hid for several days in the woods before returning to Philadelphia. His testimony illuminated the gang's recruitment methods, showing how they lured unsuspecting individuals under the guise of legitimate employment. The investigation soon expanded beyond Delaware. Maryland officials searched properties linked to gang members, while Pennsylvania authorities documented the broader kidnapping network. What had begun as a local investigation now became an interstate pursuit. This shift represented a new era of law enforcement. For the first time, authorities recognized the Cannon Gang as an organized criminal conspiracy, requiring a coordinated response. Federal officials from Washington, D.C. eventually became involved, laying the groundwork for future interstate anti-crime efforts. On April 13, 1829, a Delaware grand jury composed of 24 white men handed down 4 murder indictments against Martha, Patty Cannon. Signed by James Rogers, the state's attorney general, these charges marked the first time anyone from Cannon's notorious gang faced serious legal consequences for crimes committed against African Americans. The jury, comprised of farmers, merchants, and professionals, reflected a cross-section of Delaware society at the time. This moment marked the beginning of the legal reckoning for a criminal enterprise that had operated unchecked for decades. The willingness of the jury to indict a white woman for the murder of African Americans marked a significant transformation in legal attitudes, influenced largely by the overwhelming evidence and the cross-state nature of the crimes. The indictments were exceptionally detailed for the era.
Patty Cannon was charged with the murder of an infant girl on April 26, 1822,
a young boy on the same day, an adult male on October 1, 1820, and a black boy on June 1, 1824. Each of these charges carried the death penalty, and the evidence against her was formidable. The precision of these accusations reflected the exhaustive investigation undertaken by authorities. In contrast to many criminal cases of the time that depended heavily on witness statements and circumstantial evidence, this case was built upon physical findings, corroborating testimonies, and confessions from an insider with first-hand knowledge of the gang's activities. This combination of evidence types rendered the defense virtually powerless. Cyrus James's testimony became the foundation of the prosecution's case. His intimate understanding of the gang's operations, coupled with his ability to guide investigators to burial sites, made him one of the most valuable witnesses in Delaware's legal history. Once forced into a life of crime as a child, James now had the power to bring down the woman who had terrorized the region for decades. The prosecution was led by Attorney General James Rogers, renowned for his skill in handling complex criminal prosecutions. He recognized that this case presented a critical opportunity to demonstrate that the law applied to all individuals, regardless of race or status, and that a successful conviction would send a powerful message to other criminal enterprises. Patty Cannon herself was a figure who resisted easy classification. Contemporary newspapers portrayed her as a large, physically intimidating woman who commanded both fear and respect, even among hardened criminals. At around 70 years old, she was still mentally sharp and unyielding, showing no remorse despite the overwhelming evidence. Descriptions of her time in custody depicted an unrepentant criminal, seemingly bewildered that her business was being treated as murder. She viewed the people she exploited and killed not as human beings but as property, and could not comprehend why she was being prosecuted. Her imprisonment in Sussex County Jail reflected the gravity of her crimes and the unprecedented nature of having a woman face multiple murder charges. She was kept under constant guard, as authorities feared both escape and retaliation from surviving gang members. The Georgetown Jail, a basic stone structure from the early 1800s intended for petty criminals and debtors, was not suited for such a dangerous inmate. Special security measures were introduced, including extra guards and reinforced bars and locks. During her time in custody, Cannon began to openly discuss her crimes. She reportedly admitted to killing at least 24 individuals over the course of her career, including kidnapped African Americans, rival slave traders, witnesses, and anyone who threatened her operations. The cold, businesslike tone of her confessions horrified even seasoned lawmen, as she described the murders of adults and children with unsettling detachment. Her confessions revealed crimes stretching back to the early 1810s, kidnappings involving hundreds of victims, and a vast criminal network spanning multiple states. Authorities realized that the bodies uncovered on her property were only a small portion of her victims. The legal process moved forward with remarkable speed. The weight of evidence and public demand for justice propelled the case toward a rapid trial. Records indicate Cannon's trial was expected within weeks, with execution to follow swiftly if convicted. The prosecution's approach was simple: present the overwhelming physical evidence, support it with testimonies from James and others, and allow the jury to deliver an inevitable guilty verdict. Her defense could only appeal to mercy due to her age and gender, arguments that few believed would prevail given the monstrous nature of her crimes. The trial was set to begin in late May 1829, with jury selection planned for the preceding week. Legal observers from across the region prepared to witness one of Delaware's most important prosecutions, and newspapers from Philadelphia to Baltimore announced plans for extensive coverage. However, the trial would never reach its conclusion. On May 11, 1829, roughly 3 weeks before her scheduled execution, Cannon was found dead in her cell. Her death was officially declared a suicide by poison, though the circumstances remain uncertain. Some reports suggested she had been smuggled arsenic by sympathizers, while others claimed she had been stockpiling poison over time. Her lifeless body was discovered during morning rounds, lying on the cell floor. There were no signs of violence, and the cell was locked from the outside. A small vial was found hidden in her clothing, which tests indicated had contained arsenic. Her death sent shockwaves through the jail and the surrounding community, abruptly ending one of the most notorious criminal cases of the 19th century. The mystery of how Cannon acquired the poison was never fully solved by investigators. The jail's security measures were rudimentary compared to modern standards, and visitors were not thoroughly searched before meeting with inmates. It was plausible that a sympathizer smuggled the poison to her during one of these visits, though no individual was ever identified as the source. Some contemporaries believed that Cannon had intended to end her life from the moment she was arrested. She had previously witnessed the execution of her daughter's first husband and understood the fate that awaited her upon conviction. Choosing to avoid the public spectacle of execution, she ended her life on her own terms, exerting control over her destiny until the very end. Her death deprived victims' families of the opportunity to see her formally punished, yet it brought closure to one of the most organized and brutal criminal operations in early American history. Court records indicate that her death effectively dismantled the reverse underground railroad that had thrived along the Delmarva Peninsula for nearly 20 years. In the immediate aftermath, chaos ensued. Authorities had been preparing for what was expected to be Delaware's most significant criminal trial, and her suicide left many questions unanswered about the full scope of the gang's activities. The investigation continued for several months, but without her direct testimony, crucial details about the criminal network remained obscured. Her surviving accomplices met different fates. Joseph Johnson, her son-in-law and key partner, fled to Alabama or Mississippi before the legal actions began. His brother Ebenezer escaped to the Deep South as well, where they likely continued their illicit trade beyond Delaware's reach. Local law enforcement made minimal efforts to capture them, hindered by jurisdictional boundaries and long distances that made prosecution improbable. The only figure left to face justice was Cyrus James, the young man who had been forced into criminality. His cooperation with investigators earned him not punishment but liberation. Delaware courts acknowledged that James had been coerced and that his testimony was essential to exposing the gang's crimes. They granted him his freedom and ensured his protection against retaliation. Afterward, he was relocated to Pennsylvania, where abolitionists assisted him in creating a new identity and beginning a lawful life. Some historical accounts suggest that he later became involved in the Underground Railroad, using his insider knowledge of criminal networks to aid enslaved people seeking freedom. The investigation uncovered that the Cannon-Johnson gang had been responsible for the kidnapping of hundreds of free African Americans over the years. While the precise number remains debated, even conservative estimates suggest they trafficked between 500 and 1,000 individuals into slavery in the Deep South. Economically, these kidnappings were worth millions in modern currency, considering the prices enslaved people fetched in southern markets. The human toll, however, far outweighed financial calculations. Each abduction shattered families, stole lives, and reinforced a system that commodified human beings. Many victims were never rescued, living out their lives in bondage far from home. Families were torn apart, children separated from parents, spouses ripped from one another, and entire communities lived under the constant threat of similar raids. The gang's reach was geographically vast. Evidence gathered by authorities revealed links to trafficking networks stretching from New York to Louisiana. Cannon's operation was part of a broader system of illegal human trade that exploited jurisdictional confusion and weak law enforcement during the early 19th century. Following her death, Cannon was buried in the graveyard of the Georgetown jail without ceremony, a reflection of the community's desire to erase her memory. When the land was later converted into a parking lot, her remains were relocated to a potter's field near a new prison. In an unsettling twist that reflected sensationalist fascination with her crimes, her skull was separated from her body and exhibited in various places for decades. As late as 1961, it was on display at the Dover Public Library, serving as a grim reminder of one of Delaware's darkest histories. This treatment of her remains, while disturbing today, illustrates the enduring public intrigue surrounding her crimes. Patty Cannon's legacy extends beyond her personal acts of brutality. Her story exposes the systemic violence that underpinned American slavery, the vulnerability of free African Americans in the antebellum era, and the exploitation of legal and geographic loopholes by organized criminals. The reverse Underground Railroad she operated functioned as a sinister counterpart to the networks that helped enslaved people escape to freedom, reminding us that for every narrative of liberation, countless others endured re-enslavement and death. Modern historians continue to examine the Cannon case as a prime example of how criminal enterprises thrived in the gaps between jurisdictions. Her ability to operate unchecked for nearly 2 decades, despite the community's awareness, underscores how racism, legal inadequacies, and economic incentives allowed such atrocities to persist. The case also highlights the weaknesses of early 19th century law enforcement. Poor coordination between states, the lack of professional policing, and limited communication all contributed to the gang's impunity. These lessons would later shape strategies to combat interstate crime. The surrounding community bore the lasting impact. The area near Johnson's Crossroads was permanently scarred by its association with the Cannon gang and never fully escaped the shadow of its grim history. The town was eventually renamed Reliance in an attempt to distance itself from the infamy that had taken root, but the stigma endured for generations. Property values in the region stayed low for decades, and many families chose to move away rather than live in a place so deeply connected to such horrors. The Cannon case also carried wider implications for how American society viewed race and crime. The authorities' decision to finally prosecute these atrocities, despite the fact that most of the victims were African Americans, signaled a small but meaningful shift in legal attitudes. Though this change was limited and short-lived, it showed a growing acknowledgement that all individuals, regardless of race, were entitled to legal protection. The meticulous documentation and investigation of Cannon's activities became an important resource for the rising abolitionist movement. The highly organized nature of the kidnapping ring, combined with the ease with which free African Americans could be dragged into slavery, offered abolitionists compelling proof that the entire system of slavery was morally rotten and structurally dangerous. In the years after Cannon's death, her story entered local folklore, though the facts were often twisted or exaggerated. Numerous books, pamphlets, and newspaper articles retold her crimes, blending fact and fiction in ways that made it difficult to distinguish reality from legend. One of the most notable examples was George Alfred Townsend's 1884 novel, The Entailed Hat, which transformed Cannon's history into a sensational tale of frontier villainy. For decades, the site of Cannon's house remained a macabre point of interest. Curious visitors journeyed to the isolated location to see where her crimes had taken place, and local residents turned that fascination into a small tourist industry by offering guided tours and selling mementos. The house itself was finally demolished in 1948, yet the land continued to draw those intrigued by its sinister past well into the modern era. This case illustrates how easily society can overlook systematic violence when the victims are dehumanized. Patty Cannon's long reign of terror was tolerated until her crimes began affecting white victims, individuals whose disappearances demanded attention. The same legal system that ignored the abduction and murder of free African Americans was galvanized only when Cannon's activities disrupted the interests of white slave traders. Her story stands as a chilling reminder of humanity's capacity for cruelty and the critical need for vigilant law enforcement and communal accountability. It shows how criminal networks thrive when society fails to protect its most vulnerable. Most importantly, it preserves the memory of the hundreds of victims whose identities have largely been lost to history, but whose suffering should never be diminished or forgotten. Do you think the entire truth about her criminal empire ever came to light? Evidence strongly suggests that Patty Cannon's gang was merely one part of a much larger web of illegal human trafficking that reached far beyond the Delaware-Maryland border. Countless questions remain unanswered about the full scale of their operations and the ultimate fates of their victims. Share your thoughts in the comments and reflect on this grim episode in American history. If you found this story compelling and want to hear more haunting accounts from America's hidden past, be sure to subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this with others who are drawn to the nation's forgotten crimes. Join us next time as we delve into another chilling true story from the darker corners of American history.